He had not spoken to another living soul in 4 years. He had a rifle, a horse, and a mountain that asked nothing of him. That was exactly how he wanted it. Then a woman fell through his door in a blizzard, looked straight down the barrel of his gun, and said 5 words that changed everything. This is the story of a man who built walls out of grief, and the woman who walked through every single one. Welcome to this channel, where every story we tell is set in the rugged, honest heart of the American West. Cowboys and lawmen, outlaws and healers, mothers who fought for their children and strangers who chose to love. This story will remind you that grief is not the end of the road. Sometimes the person who saves you does not ride in with a badge and a plan. Sometimes they just show up in a blizzard and refuse to leave. If this story moved you, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The wind came down off Black Elk Ridge like something that had a grudge. It was the kind of wind that found every gap in your coat, every loose board on your cabin wall, every weakness you thought you had sealed up tight. Colt Hargrove had been listening to it for 4 years. He knew its moods the way a man knows the moods of someone he has decided to hate and cannot leave. He was standing at his front window when the pounding started. Not a knock. A fist hitting wood with the particular rhythm of someone who understood they were running out of time. 2 beats, a pause, 2 more. Hard and steady, like a heartbeat that refused to quit. Colt did not move right away. He stood in the dark of his cabin and listened and let his mind work through the possibilities the way he had been trained to do years ago in another life. Nobody came up the Black Elk Trail in a blizzard by choice. Nobody who knew him would come at all, which meant whoever was out there either did not know better or did not have a choice. He picked up the rifle from the rack beside the door. He checked the load without looking at his hands. He put his back to the wall beside the door frame and said loud enough to carry through the wood, "Step back from the door." A pause. Then a woman's voice, hoarse and tight with cold. "I am not armed, and I cannot feel my feet. I would step back, but I am not certain I would stay upright." Colt opened the door. She fell forward into the light. He had the rifle raised, and she was looking straight down the barrel, and she did not flinch. Her lips were the color of a winter sky, blue-gray and threatening. She had one hand clamped around the handle of a black leather bag, and the other hand caught the door frame before she went all the way down. Her dark auburn hair was plastered flat against her face. Snow was packed into the collar of her coat. She looked at the rifle. She looked at him. "Shoot if you need to," she said, with a steadiness that had no right to be there. "But let me warm up first." Colt lowered the rifle 1 inch. He looked past her into the dark and the driving white and saw nothing moving. He looked back at her. "You alone?" "My horse threw me 1/2 mile back and ran, so yes, unless you count the blizzard." He stepped aside and let her in. She made it 3 steps to the nearest wall and put her back against it and slid down until she was sitting on the floor with her knees up and her eyes closed. Her breathing was the shallow, careful breathing of someone who understood they were in trouble and was working the problem. Colt set the rifle on the table. He went to the fireplace and built the fire up without being asked. He found the spare wool blanket from the chest and dropped it on the floor beside her. He filled the tin kettle from the bucket and hung it over the flames. She had not said thank you. She had not said anything. She was pulling her gloves off finger by finger, checking her own hands in the firelight with the focused expression of someone running a medical assessment. "You a doctor?" he said. "Yes." She said it the way you say your own name, a fact that required no defense. Colt looked at the black bag on the floor beside her. Then he looked at her again. A woman doctor in Colorado Territory in the year 1874 was not exactly common. He had known one in his life before the mountain, and she had been the most capable person in any room she entered, and nobody had ever let her forget she was not supposed to be there. "There is a farmhouse 4 miles east," she said, working on the second glove now. A woman named Ellen Marsh. She is in labor, and it is not going well. The midwife in town was not available. A pause. She was drunk. I took a horse I did not know well enough. The trail disappeared in the dark. Colt looked at the window. The blizzard had no opinion about Ellen Marsh. "The Marsh place," he said. "You know it?" "I know where it is." "Then you know the trail." He did not say anything. The woman on his floor looked up at him. Her eyes were green, the deep, steady green of pine in summer, and they were doing the same assessment on him that she had just done on her own hands. He did not particularly enjoy being read. "I am not asking you to like it," she said. "I am asking you if you know the trail." "I heard you the first time." "Then I am waiting for an answer." Colt went to get his coat. He told her she would ride Ghost and he would walk. She told him she was capable of walking. He told her they did not have time for capable. They had time for fast. She did not argue after that, which told him she was smart enough to know when to push and when to move. The trail was bad, but he had run it in worse. Ghost knew the ridge the way a horse knows its own pasture and did not put a foot wrong. The woman in the saddle did not complain about the cold or the dark or the pace. She held the saddle horn with one hand and her medical bag with the other and kept her eyes forward. They reached the Marsh farmhouse in just under an hour. What happened inside was not Colt's business, and he waited outside with Ghost in the wind and listened to the sounds a house makes when someone is fighting hard for something important. The sounds changed after a while. Then there was a different sound entirely, small and furious. The announcement of a new person who had decided to show up despite the circumstances. The woman came to the door after another half hour. She was still wearing her coat, sleeves rolled back. A tiredness in her face that came from the particular weight of having mattered enormously for a concentrated period of time. "Mother and daughter are both well," she said. Colt nodded. They rode back in the dark and the wind. About halfway up the ridge trail, she said without preamble, "My name is Nora Calloway. Edmund Calloway was my father." Colt's hands tightened on the reins. He knew that name. He had been trying very hard for 6 months not to think about that name and what had happened to the man who carried it. He said nothing. She did not push it. He left her at the door of the clinic on the edge of town as the first gray light was starting to feel its way over the ridge. She stepped down from Ghost and turned and looked at him with those steady green eyes. "Thank you," she said. Just that. Colt turned Ghost and headed back up the mountain without answering. He rode the whole way thinking about the name Calloway and what it meant that she was here and what it meant that she had that look in her eyes. Not the look of a woman who had come to grieve, but the look of a woman who had come to find something out. Inside the clinic, on her father's old desk, there was a letter she had not yet opened. It was postmarked from a town in New Mexico. There was no return address. She would not open it until the next evening. 3 words in a handwriting she did not know. Don't trust anyone. No signature, no explanation. She read it twice. She set it face down on the desk. She looked out the window at the dark ridge rising above the town. Then she went to work. Doc Edmund Calloway had been a methodical man. Nora had known this about her father since she was 7 years old, when she had watched him catalog every tool in his medical bag by function, by frequency of use, and by whether it could be cleaned with carbolic or needed to be replaced. He had a system for everything. His clinic was a testament to that system even now, 6 months after his death and 3 days into Nora's arrival. She could tell immediately that someone had been through it. It was the small things. A drawer that had been removed and replaced at a slightly wrong angle, not enough to notice unless you knew how precisely her father fitted things into their places. A floorboard near the back wall that gave a different sound underfoot than its neighbors, recently lifted and relaid. Files in the cabinet that were in almost the right order, the kind of almost right that meant someone had been thorough, but not thorough enough. They had been looking for something. She spent the better part of her second day going through the clinic, the way her father had taught her to approach a patient, systematically, from the obvious to the obscure. She found what she was looking for on the third pass. Tucked inside the hollowed-out heel of an old boot shoved to the back of the lowest shelf beneath the examining table. A piece of paper folded into quarters and folded again. A list written in her father's careful hand. Names she did not recognize, numbers beside them, dates, parcel designations. Land records. And at the top of the list, circled once in red ink, a name she would come to know very well. W. Rutherford. She was still studying the paper when Ruth McAllister arrived with a covered plate and the manner of a woman doing something that seemed simple and was not. Ruth was 61 and had the build of someone who had done hard physical work for a very long time. She ran the only boarding house in Coldwater Bluff, and she had been Doc Calloway's closest friend for going on 20 years. She set the plate on the desk, poured coffee from the pot on the stove without being invited, and sat down across from Nora. They looked at each other. "You are going to ask questions," Ruth said. "You have been asking questions since you arrived, quietly and carefully, the same way your father did. I watched him do it for months before things went wrong." Nora said, "Tell me about Wade Rutherford." Ruth picked up her coffee cup and did not drink from it. "I will tell you this much right now, and the rest will have to wait until I trust you a little more. Do not ask about your father in public. Not in this town. Not where walls have ears." "Whose walls?" Ruth looked at her steadily. "Every set of walls that man owns or rents or stands near." Nora filed this away. She showed Ruth the list from the boot heel. Ruth looked at it a long time. "Your father was building something," Ruth said. "I knew he was doing it. I did not know how far along he was." After Ruth left, Nora went back to work. Behind a loose brick in the clinic's fireplace, which she found because her father had always been particular about loose things that should not be loose, she found the journal. It was a small book, cloth-covered, the handwriting inside dense and purposeful. Her father's private record of whatever had gotten him killed. She read it at the desk by lamplight, long past the time she should have stopped. The last entry was short. Written in a hurry, the pen pressed harder than usual, the words leaning forward as though trying to get somewhere before the time ran out. "If something happens to me, find Hargrove. He is the only man who ever beat Rutherford and walked away." And below that, smaller, barely legible, like an afterthought her father almost did not commit to paper. Rutherford did not plan the Glenwood Pass job alone. Someone inside gave him the timetable. I think I know who. God help us both if I am right. Nora sat with the journal closed in her hands and looked at the fire. She had seen Wade Rutherford that morning through the clinic window. He had come out of the bank at 10 o'clock and spent 20 minutes on the boardwalk, shaking hands and passing the time of day with everyone who walked by. He was well-dressed, easy in his manner, the kind of man who made everyone around him feel settled and accounted for. He had good teeth and a wide smile that he deployed with the precision of a tool. His eyes were a different matter. His eyes move the way a man's eyes move when he is not actually talking, but is counting things. She had watched him from behind the clinic window and felt the specific chill of recognizing something dangerous wearing a comfortable face. He had looked up once, directly at the clinic window. She had not moved back in time. Their eyes had met for 2 seconds through the glass. His smile had not changed at all. Now she sat in the dark with her father's last words in her hands and the letter from New Mexico face down on the corner of the desk. And she thought about Colt Hargrove and what it meant that her father, in the last days of his life, had written his name as the only hope. She had met the man. She had looked at him in the dark at the top of a mountain trail, in a blizzard, while he was pointing a rifle at her. She had seen his face in the firelight. She had ridden his horse and felt him guide the animal through a storm without a word of uncertainty. He was dangerous in the same way the mountain was dangerous. Not hostile, exactly, just absolute. Just not built to accommodate anything that could not survive the conditions. The question was whether she could get him down from that mountain. She thought she probably could. She was going to have to be very careful about how she asked. The trail to Colt's cabin was 2 hours on a good day. Nora did it in 2 hours and 20 minutes. which she considered acceptable given that she had borrowed a horse from the livery that did not particularly want to go uphill in cold weather, and was not shy about expressing this. She tied the horse to a pine 30 yards from the cabin and walked the rest of the way on foot. This was deliberate. She did not want to arrive at speed on an unfamiliar animal, startling a man who slept with a rifle in arm's reach. She wanted to arrive in a way that said she had thought about this. The black stallion she had ridden the night of the blizzard was standing in the small corral beside the cabin. He watched her come up the last 100 yards with his ears forward and his eyes calm. He did not move away. Colt was splitting wood behind the cabin. He heard her before she rounded the corner, and he set the axe down on the stump and stood with his arms at his sides and waited. "Miss Calloway," he said. No inflection. Not unwelcoming. Not welcoming. "I need to talk to you," she said. "You rode 2 hours to say that. I rode 2 hours because you do not appear to have a telegraph line." Something moved in his expression. It was not a smile. It was the place where a smile would be if he still made them regularly. "I will make coffee," he said, and went inside. She followed him without being invited. He did not comment on this. The cabin was spare in the way of a place built for function and nothing beyond function. Clean, ordered. The rifle was on the rack. Maps on the wall with handwritten notations she would have liked to study if she had come here for a different reason. A single chair at the table and a second one by the fire that had been pulled up close, which suggested he spent a great deal of his time in that spot, alone, looking at the fire. She put her father's journal on the table while the coffee was heating. He looked at it from across the room. He did not move toward it. "Read the last page," she said. He crossed to the table and picked up the journal and read it standing up. His jaw tightened. The muscle along his forearm went hard. He read the last paragraph a second time and then set the journal down. "You know who Wade Rutherford is," she said. "Yes. You know what he did." "I know what he did to me. He killed my father." A silence. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a low, steady sound like something running far away. "I know," Colt said. "You knew." She kept her voice level. "You knew, and you stayed on this mountain. Your father knew the risks. He was not a child. No, he was a 63-year-old physician who believed that having the right on your side was worth something. That was his mistake. I am not going to make it." She looked at him steadily. "I am not asking you to care about justice or right and wrong or any other thing that sounds like a sermon. I am asking you to help me build a case that will hold in a territorial court, because you know how Wade Rutherford operates, and I do not." Colt looked at her. "You have been up here 4 years," she said. "Your hands still know how to work a rifle. You are not a man who stopped caring about things. You are a man who decided it cost too much to care about things. That is different." He was very still. She had the impression she had said something that landed somewhere important, and that he was deciding how he felt about that. "I help you find evidence," he said finally. "Evidence only. When it is done, you forget this trail exists." "When it is done," she said, "you decide what you want to forget." He did not answer. He went and got his coat and his rifle, and he saddled Ghost. They rode down together, and Coldwater Bluff appeared below them in the gray afternoon light, smoke rising from chimneys, the main street quiet in the midday cold. Nora watched Colt's face as the town came into view. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a place he has been trying to persuade himself he did not miss. The bank was the first thing you saw coming in from the Ridge Road. It was the best-maintained building on the street. Wade Rutherford was standing outside it. He had come out for air, or that was how it appeared. He was in his good coat, a dark wool coat that cost more than most men in this town earned in 2 months of work. He saw Colt, and his face opened into something that looked exactly like pleasure. "Colt Hargrove," he said, extending his hand. "Lord Almighty. I heard you were somewhere in the territory, but I did not dare hope." He pumped Colt's hand with both of his. It is good to see you, old friend. It is genuinely good. Colt shook the hand. Wade and Dr. Calloway. Wade turned his smile to Nora. I am so glad you are settling in. Your father was one of this town's great treasures. We all miss him terribly. I am sure you do, Nora said. Wade laughed as though she had said something delightful. He clapped Colt on the shoulder once, said he hoped they would have a chance to catch up, and went back inside the bank. The door closed behind him. Colt stood looking at it for a moment. Then he turned and they rode to the far end of town and tied the horses at the livery without speaking. They walked to the clinic and went inside, and Colt sat down in the chair across from the desk and looked at his hands. He knew I was coming, he said. Nora poured coffee. How can you be sure? He was standing outside that bank. Colt looked up. In the cold. Wade Rutherford does not stand in the cold for his health. He was waiting to see what I looked like when I came back into town. He paused. He had a man on that trailhead, probably from the day you arrived. Nora set the coffee in front of him. So he knows we are working together. He wanted us working together. He wanted me off that mountain. He turned the cup in his hands. Nora, your father's investigation did not draw me out. We drew ourselves out. She sat down and looked at him. He planned for this. He plans for everything. He always did. A pause. The trap is already open. He is just waiting for us to walk far enough in. Then we will have to be faster than he expects. Colt looked at her across the table. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of someone operating at a level he had not expected. They rode out of town as the afternoon light went flat and gray. Half a mile up the ridge road, Colt said, he was smiling with his eyes back there. I noticed. Wade does not smile with his eyes. He uses his mouth to smile. His eyes are always working. A pause. When his eyes are smiling too, it means he thinks he has already won. Nora looked up at the ridge. The pines were dark against a sky going purple with evening. Then we are going to need to change what he thinks, she said. Colt did not move into the town. He set up camp at the tree line on the eastern edge, 100 yards from the last building, in a spot where he could see the main street and could not be seen from it. He put up a canvas lean-to, dug a small fire pit, and arranged things the way a man arranges a position, with sight lines and exit routes in mind. Every morning before the town was properly awake, he appeared at the clinic with whatever the night had yielded. He was good at listening without being heard. He had spent 4 years alone in the mountains, and before that nearly a decade working intelligence for the Pinkertons, and both of those educations had taught him the same thing. That information traveled on the edges of conversations, rather than in the middle of them. The saloon yielded 2 names. The livery stable yielded a pattern. The gap between the bank wall and the hardware store wall yielded the knowledge that Wade Rutherford met with certain men after dark on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and that these meetings lasted between 20 minutes and an hour, and that whoever left those meetings left by the alley and not the front door. He laid it out for Nora each morning on the clinic desk, and she fitted alongside what she found in her father's records, and they built a picture piece by piece, the way a physician builds a diagnosis, following each finding to the next. They did not talk about anything that was not the work. This was by mutual unspoken agreement, and suited both of them. The small things started quietly, the way most important things start. A boy of about 8 came in one afternoon with his right arm bent at an angle that it should not be bent at, held carefully against his body with his other hand, his face white and set with the particular dignity of a child who has decided that crying would not help. His father was behind him, a big man with a rancher's hands and eyes that showed how frightened he was. Nora talked the boy through every step without ever suggesting that the step in question would hurt, which it did. But she gave him something else to think about each time. A question to answer, a small task to focus on. Her voice low and matter-of-fact, and without any pity in it, which was exactly right because pity would have broken the boy's concentration. When she was done, the arm was set and splinted, and the boy had not cried. Colt was standing in the doorway, and he watched all of this. He left before she could turn and see his face. That evening, he repaired the broken latch on the clinic's front door. He had noticed it the second morning, and it had bothered him in the particular way that a preventable vulnerability bothers a man trained to think about such things. He found what he needed in the toolbox beside the back step and fixed it in 20 minutes. Nora found it in the morning and stood looking at it for a moment. She did not say anything, and she did not ask, which meant she understood why he had done it, and understood equally well that making a thing of it would be the wrong move. She put a second tin cup on the windowsill that evening, filled with coffee before she turned in. He was in his camp at the tree line, and she could not see him from the window, and he could not see her. But in the morning, the cup was empty and rinsed and placed upside down beside the window. They did not discuss it. The mine changed things. The Harwick mine was a silver operation 2 miles east of town, run by a man named George Harwick, who had been working that particular patch of rock for 11 years, with the kind of faith that either makes a man rich or uses him up completely. On a Wednesday morning in late November, a section of the primary shaft collapsed, trapping 4 men. One of them was Billy Harwick, George's son, 9 years old, who had followed his father to the site that morning without permission, hiding in a supply wagon under a canvas, intending only to watch the men work. The collapse had not been his fault. The fact that he was there was. George Harwick came into town at a dead run, and he did not go to the sheriff's office. He went straight to the clinic, which told Nora something about the reputation she had already built in 2 weeks. Colt was at the desk when Harwick came through the door. He was up and moving before the man finished his first sentence. The collapsed section had left a gap in the debris field, a narrow one, not wide enough for a grown man to get through with any speed. Colt worked the main collapse with 2 other miners, moving rock by hand and by lever, working with the focused economy of a man who is not going to hurry because hurrying makes mistakes. The 3 men on the outside pulled close to a ton of rock in 2.5 hours. Nora went in through the gap. She did not ask permission. She pulled off her outer coat, picked up her bag, and went in on her hands and knees in the dark with a lamp tied to her wrist and a rope looped around her waist. She was in there for 40 minutes. When she came back out, she was on her hands and knees again, moving backward, and Colt caught her under the arms and pulled her upright. He checked her hands, turned them over in his, checked her eyes in the lamplight. Billy Harwick came out of the gap behind her, guided by a rope and Nora's voice calling him forward, muddy and shaking but using all 4 limbs. George Harwick went down on his knees in the dirt and put his arms around his son and made sounds that a man only makes in the deepest kind of relief. Nora and Colt sat in the dirt outside the mine entrance. The afternoon was cold and going colder, and they were both covered in mine dust, and neither of them moved for several minutes. Ghost, who had followed Colt to the site and stood ground-tied at a respectful distance throughout, walked over and lowered his big head toward Nora. She put her hand on his neck without looking up. The horse did not move away. Colt watched this and said nothing. They rode back to town in the last of the light. Nora was quiet in the saddle with a tiredness that was not weakness, but the particular kind of emptiness that follows an enormous sustained effort. Colt walked beside Ghost with his hand on the bridle and did not push the pace. When they reached the clinic, she swung down and stood for a moment with her hand still on the saddle, steadying herself. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. "You worked that collapse for almost 3 hours. There was a boy in there." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Colt." He took Ghost's reins and looped them over the post. He was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the ridge in the dark. "He ever go to that mine before?" he said finally. "Billy? No. His father kept him away from it." "Curious kid." "Apparently." "He made it." Colt looked back at her. "That is the thing. He made it." Nora looked at him steadily. She was reading something in his face, and she was letting him see that she was reading it. "Yes," she said softly. He did. Colt turned away before she could say anything else. He went to his camp at the tree line and built up his fire and sat beside it for a long time. The ridge above him was black against a sky full of winter stars, and his cabin was up there in the dark, empty and cold. For the first time in 4 years, the idea of going back to it did not feel like safety. It felt like something he would be walking away from. He did not have a word for what he would be walking away from. He was not ready to find one. He sat by the fire until late and listened to the pines. The county records office was a single room attached to the back of the courthouse, maintained by a clerk named Harold Fitch, who had held the position for 9 years and regarded any intrusion into his filing system as a personal affront. Nora kept Harold Fitch occupied. She did this by arriving with a list of questions about her father's land holdings, the deed to the clinic building, the recorded ownership of the lot behind it, and the process by which a deceased property holder's estate was formally transferred to an heir under Colorado territorial law. These were legitimate questions that she genuinely needed answers to, and Harold Fitch was the kind of man who enjoyed being the authority on legitimate questions, especially when the person asking them was willing to listen to a full explanation. While Harold explained at length and with genuine enthusiasm, Colt went through the back files. He found what they were looking for in 40 minutes. It was buried in the transfer records from 1869 through 1873, cross-referenced against current ownership, and it would not have been visible to anyone who did not know what the pattern looked like from the inside. Colt knew exactly what it looked like. Land parcel after land parcel, running in an arc around the eastern and northern edges of Coldwater Bluff, had changed hands in the past 4 years. Different sellers, different dates, different recorded prices. But the buyer was always the same, different names each time, but always routing through a holding company registered in Denver, a company with a name that changed twice but always resolved back to the same set of principles. The signatures on the original transfer documents were wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not wrong in the way that catches an ordinary eye. Wrong in the specific, technical way that a forgery is wrong when the person making it is skilled, but is working from a copy of a signature, rather than from deep familiarity with how that particular hand moves. Wrong in the way of a note that hits the right pitch, but carries no vibration. Doc Calloway had a physician's eye for fine detail. He had found this. He had been building a case with it, and he had been killed before he could take it anywhere it would stick. That night they worked until past midnight in the clinic. The papers arranged in order across the desk and the floor, the lamp turned up high. Nora made notes in her own careful hand. Colt moved through the documents in silence, occasionally placing a paper in a different position in the arrangement, restructuring the sequence to reveal the pattern more cleanly. She fell asleep at the desk somewhere around the second hour past midnight. One moment she was working, and the next she was gone, her head down on her crossed arms, her breathing slow. Colt stood over her for a long moment. He took his coat off and laid it across her shoulders. It was a heavy coat, wool and canvas, warm from being worn. She did not stir. He stood there a moment longer, not entirely sure what he was doing, and then went outside and stood in the cold dark with his hands at his sides for a long time. In the morning, she found the coat. She folded it carefully and hung it on the hook by the door. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. The coffee was on the windowsill when he arrived, 2 cups, the steam still rising. He sat down and found the thing he had been half expecting to find. Among the transfer documents was a parcel recorded 3 weeks before the Glenwood Pass ambush 5 years ago, the ambush where Clara had been killed and where his whole life had ended and begun again as something worse. The parcel had been transferred to the Denver Holding Company. The notary who had filed and certified the transfer was listed by name. That name was Clarence Aldridge, who was currently the postmaster of Coldwater Bluff and who had been living quietly in this town for going on 8 years. Colt set the paper down. He said nothing to Nora. He would need more than a name before he said anything about this to anyone. But his expression changed in a way that Nora, glancing at him over her own papers, noticed and filed away without remarking on. The conversation behind the livery stable happened that afternoon. Colt had been watching Deputy Hank Briggs for 3 days. The young man was honest. It showed in his face and the way he carried himself. The particular uprightness of someone who had always tried to do the right thing. But there was something else, too. A constrained quality. Like a man walking carefully around the edges of something he cannot afford to step on. The phrase gave it away. Twice in 3 days, in different conversations, Hank had used the same phrase when talking about lawbreakers. A wolf in the fold. It was not a common phrase. It was Wade Rutherford's phrase, one he had used in Pinkerton briefings with the pleasure of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own particular expressions. Nobody arrived at that phrase independently. Hank had heard it from Wade. Hank and Wade were talking regularly. Colt found Hank alone behind the livery at dusk, brushing his horse, and laid it out without raising his voice or putting heat in it. Hank stopped brushing. He stood with his back to Colt for a long moment. Then he turned around, and his face had the look of a man who has been braced for a particular door to open and has not been looking forward to it. He told Colt about the shooting. 2 years ago, a foot chase, a man who turned and reached inside his coat, and Hank had fired and the man had gone down, and when they reached him, he was unarmed, the thing inside his coat a flask of whiskey. The man survived, badly injured. The incident was buried at Wade Rutherford's suggestion with Wade's quiet assistance, and a witness statement documenting exactly what had happened went into Wade's safe rather than the courthouse. "How much does he know about what Dr. Calloway and I have found?" Colt said. "Everything up to 4 days back." Hank's voice was flat with shame. He asked questions, and I answered them. I did not know what he was going to do with it. "You suspected." Hank said nothing. 4 days of lead," Colt said. "That is what we have. Are you willing to use it?" Hank did not answer right away. He stood there with the brush in his hand and looked at the ground. The pause told Colt what he needed to know about the man's character, not that he was weak, but that he understood the full weight of what he was being asked to do, and was not going to pretend otherwise. That evening, Wade Rutherford's written invitation arrived at the clinic. Formal, polite, expressing his hope that Dr. Calloway would call at the bank at her earliest convenience to discuss certain outstanding accounts related to her father's estate. The handwriting was even and unhurried. The smile in the phrasing was not. Nora read it twice. She set it face up on the desk and looked at it. "He is telling us he knows where the investigation is," she said. "Yes." Colt looked at the letter from across the room. "And he is telling us we do not have as much time as we thought." Nora sent a message to the bank in the morning. She regretted she was unable to meet today, a patient matter requiring her full attention. She would reach out to reschedule at her earliest opportunity. She did not have a patient. This was a calculated courtesy, the kind that says, "I see what you are doing and I am not frightened of it." She was a little frightened of it. She was not going to let that show. She was out on a call to a family 3 miles east when someone went through the clinic. She had locked it, the new lock Colt had installed, and whoever came in had a key, or the skill to work around a key, and they had moved through the space the way professionals move through a space, touching as little as possible and putting everything back as close to where it had been as made no difference. Except for her father's journal, which was gone. She stood in the middle of the clinic and assessed it the same way she had assessed the disorder she had found on her first day, methodically, without allowing her anger to get in front of her thinking. She checked each place where she had found something hidden. The boot heel was empty. The loose brick in the fireplace, which held nothing she had not moved already, was back in place but set at the wrong angle. She told Colt when he came in at dark. He listened to her tell it, and she watched him make the internal calculation, the sequence of what it meant and what it changed. And she watched his jaw set. "You should have kept the original somewhere else," he said. "I know that. It was a mistake." "I said I know that." She kept her voice even. "I made a mistake. I also have the notes I transcribed, which are in my coat pocket, and have been since I finished them, so the loss is not total. It is total enough. Then perhaps, instead of outlining my errors, you could help me think about what we do next. They were standing across the desk from each other, and the lamplight was between them, and they were both speaking quietly and with a precision that had heat underneath it. She watched him check something in himself. She felt herself check the same something. "You have been treating this like a case," she said. "Cases to you are things that get solved and closed. I am not a case. This is not your case. My father was murdered, and I am the only person in this territory who is going to make that mean anything, and I need you to treat me like a partner instead of a liability." Colt looked at her. He was not angry anymore. His expression had moved to something quieter and more careful. "I know," he said. "Then act like it." A long silence. The fire moved. Outside, the wind pushed at the window boards the way it always did at this hour. "I was 12 minutes late," Colt said. Nora waited. The Glenwood Pass. The convoy was moving on a route I had given Wade. I had told him the timetable. I had trusted him with it because he was my partner, and you trust your partner with your life. That is how it is supposed to work. His voice was level and quiet. The flatness of a man who has said this to himself so many times it no longer varies. Clara was on that wagon because she was visiting her sister in Grand Junction, and the escort was the safest route. Nobody was supposed to know she was on it. I was riding to meet them at the crossroads. I was 12 minutes behind where I should have been. He stopped. By the time I got there, the smoke was up. Nora did not say she was sorry. He was not telling her this to receive condolence. "I have not told anyone that," he said. "Because I am not going to use it against you," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the fire. "Philadelphia," she said. 12 years. A medical degree from the Woman's Medical College, which was the only institution in the country that would grant one to a woman, and then 12 years of trying to practice in a city that had decided that a woman physician was either a novelty or a problem. Colleagues who would not shake my hand. A patient who thanked me when we were alone, and then, when the supervising physician walked in, looked at the wall as if I had not been there. She paused. I stopped expecting anyone to stand beside me. It was easier than hoping for it. "Easier," Colt said. The word came out slowly, like he was taking its measure. "Yes. I know what that costs." He crossed to where she was standing and put his hand on her shoulder. Not a gesture of comfort, not tender. Solid. The kind of contact you use when you want someone to feel the ground is still there. "I am not good at staying," he said. "It is something I have worked to become bad at." A pause. "I am working on the reverse." She looked at him with her steady green eyes, and she did not look away. And he did not look away, and the fire between them moved. In the morning, he left early on a supply errand, and Nora straightened the clinic alone. She moved his coat from the chair to the proper hook by the door, and a small paper fell from the inner pocket. It landed face up on the floor at her feet. She picked it up, a note, the paper soft and worn at the creases from long, repeated folding, the way paper gets when it has lived in a pocket for years. A woman's handwriting, 2 lines. "Come home before dark. I will have supper waiting." And a letter C at the bottom for a name that had become just the one initial, the kind of shorthand that belongs to people who have said each other's names so many times, the whole name is implied. Nora stood in the empty clinic, holding this. She was not a jealous woman, and she did not think of it as jealousy. She thought of it as understanding. He had been carrying this in his coat for 5 years. Clara was that close to him, in his pocket, against his chest. Every single day he had gone on existing when he did not particularly want to. He had kept her that close and that far away at the same time. She folded the note carefully and put it back exactly as she had found it. She hung the coat on the hook and went to make the coffee. That afternoon, Colt laid out the problem on the desk between them. The forged documents were evidence, but they were not enough without judicial authority to compel Wade to open his financial records. The man they needed was Judge Elias Cormac, currently in Pueblo, 2 days hard riding south. Cormac was the only territorial judge with the authority to issue the kind of order that would stick, and the reputation for not being in anyone's pocket. To approach Cormac officially, Colt said, "I cannot go as a private citizen. I have to go as a documented former Pinkerton operative, which means filing paperwork, which means anyone in the territories who has a reason to know where I am will know within a week. How many people have that reason?" "Enough." Nora looked at him across the desk. "And you would be leaving me here. For 5 days, you, Ruth, and Hank. Wade already knows the investigation is active. He does not yet know what we have. If I move fast, he will not know until we are ready for him to know." He looked at her steadily. "Can you hold 5 days?" She looked back at him with the same steadiness. "What happens if you do not come back?" The question sat in the air between them. He did not brush it off. He did not tell her that nothing would happen to him. He looked at her with the open honesty of a man who had been careful not to make promises for a very long time, and was choosing to stop being careful. "I will come back," he said. She held his eyes a moment longer. "Then I will hold 5 days." He rode out in the gray hour before sunrise. She stood in the clinic doorway and watched him go, Ghost moving steadily up the ridge road, Colt's back straight and easy in the saddle. He turned once, at the point where the road bent around the first stand of pine, and looked back. She was still standing there. He turned forward and rode. She went inside. She put the second coffee cup on the windowsill out of habit, and then stood there looking at it. He would come back. She was certain of this the same way she was certain of a set bone, not because she wanted it to be true, but because she had assessed the man, and she knew how he was built. She turned around and went to work. Nora did not wait. She understood waiting as a skill. She had learned it in medical school and refined it through 12 years of practice, the particular discipline of knowing when to move and when to let conditions develop. But waiting in the sense of sitting still and letting other people decide things was not something she had ever been any good at, and she saw no reason to start now. She called on Ruth McAllister on the second day after Colt left, arriving with a covered dish on the pretext of returning one Ruth had brought her 2 weeks prior. They sat in Ruth's kitchen and drank coffee and talked around the edges of things for 15 minutes, and then Ruth put down her cup and looked at the table for a while. "Edmund came to me," Ruth said, "the week before he died. He brought something, and he asked me to keep it. He said that if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone I trusted completely." She looked up. "I have been waiting 6 months." She went to the wall beside the kitchen hearth and pressed on a panel that looked like it fitted flush but did not, and brought out a sealed envelope. Inside, in Nora's father's meticulous hand, was a notarized copy of 4 forged land transfer documents, each one annotated with a line-by-line comparison between the original recorded signatures and the forgeries. Alongside the copies was a sworn written statement signed by Edmund Calloway and dated 4 months before his death, addressed to the Territorial Court of Colorado and naming Wade Rutherford specifically, and describing the scheme in precise, documented detail. Her father had known. He had known someone might come for him. He had prepared. Nora sat with the envelope in her hands and felt the specific grief of being the daughter of a man you could not stop being proud of. "He was not surprised," Ruth said quietly, "when it happened. I think he knew they were getting close." Nora looked up. Why did he not send this to the court himself? Because he knew it would be intercepted. Wade has people watching the stage office and the post. Edmund knew that. He was waiting for someone he could trust to carry it. He was waiting for Colt Hargrove. Yes. That afternoon, Wade Rutherford came to the clinic. He brought 2 men with him who positioned themselves without being told to, one at the front door and one inside near the back. Wade sat down across from the desk and folded his hands on the surface of it and looked at Nora with the composed attention of a man who has already decided how a conversation ends. He was not wearing his usual smile. "Your father was a good man," he said. "Conscientious. Thorough. These are admirable qualities." He paused. "They are also the qualities that lead a man to involve himself in matters above his understanding." Nora looked at him. What matters were above his understanding? The complexity of land development, the number of moving parts in a significant business enterprise, the way that certain necessary transactions appear, to an uninformed eye, to be something other than what they are. His voice was pleasant and entirely without warmth. "I think your father saw something he did not fully understand and drew a conclusion that was not accurate. I believe he may have communicated this inaccurate conclusion to certain parties. That is how misunderstandings escalate." "My father's handwriting was very precise," Nora said. "His conclusions tended to be accurate." Something moved behind Wade's eyes. Not anger, calculation. "I would hate to see you drawn into a situation that has no good outcome for you," he said. "You are a physician. You have a real contribution to make to this community. Coldwater Bluff needs a doctor." He stood. "I am going to give you some time. Your friend is in Pueblo, I understand. When he returns, perhaps the four of us can sit down together and find a resolution that works for everyone." He knew exactly where Colt had gone. The two men left with him. 20 minutes later, Nora looked out the window and saw a different man she did not know sitting on the bench across the street, doing nothing in particular, but doing it in the direction of the clinic. She was being watched. She found a pretext to walk past the window twice. There was a second man at the far end of the street. She went to the back of the clinic and sat down and thought carefully. The envelope was in her coat pocket. It had been there since Ruth gave it to her. She was not going to move it to anywhere less secure, but she could not get it to Cormac without Colt's authorization from Pueblo to back it, and she could not get word to Colt on the road. What she could do was make sure he came back to a situation he could work with. Hank Briggs came around to the clinic's back window that evening. He moved quietly for a man his size. He passed a folded note through the gap at the bottom of the window where the seal had shrunk in the cold. She opened it. "Do not let him come in from the South Road." That was all. She sat with the note for a moment. Then she went to find P.T. Morrison, who was 10 years old, lived 2 doors from the boarding house, and had the alertness and discretion of a much older person, characteristics that Nora had noticed and filed for exactly this kind of need. She gave him a quarter and a piece of paper and very specific instructions. He was to sit at the north end of the main road, specifically at the spot where the cottonwood with the double trunk stood, starting tomorrow morning and every morning after, until a man came in from that direction riding a large black horse. He was to give the man the paper. He was not to tell anyone about any part of this. Petey looked at the quarter and then at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. With the gravity of someone who understood he had just been trusted with something real. She wrote the note, short enough to be memorized quickly in case it could not be kept. "Wade knows the south approach. Come in from the ridge." On the 4th night, she sat by the clinic window and looked at the dark road and thought about what Colt had told her about Clara and about what it had cost him to say it. She thought about the note in the coat pocket and the way the paper was worn at the folds. She thought about what it meant that a man kept a note like that not in a box, not tucked away somewhere reverential, but in his pocket, against his chest, where he could feel the weight of it. She thought about what he had said. "I told her I was ready." He had not said that yet. That was still coming. But she understood, sitting in the dark on the 4th night of the 5, that he was going to. She was ready too. She went to bed and slept better than she had any right to. The first night out of Pueblo, camped in a creek hollow with the cottonwoods rattling in the dark above him, Colt woke at 2 in the morning from a dream he had been having for 5 years. In the dream, Clara was on the wagon. He was running. He was always running, and the distance between them never closed, the wagon always just ahead. The road always lengthening beneath his boots. And in the dream, he understood exactly what was coming. And he ran anyway, because in dreams you cannot choose to stop. This time the dream changed. He was still running, but when the wagon reached the part where it stopped, and the smoke was there and the world went wrong, he looked down and the distance had closed, and he was there, and the person turning to look at him from the wagon seat was not Clara. It was Nora. He woke up hard and sat against the cottonwood in the creek hollow until his breathing settled. Ghost shifted his weight nearby and blew once, checking. Colt sat in the dark with his hands on his knees and let the dream be what it was. He was afraid. Not of Wade Rutherford, not of the men Wade could put in the field, not of the accumulated enemies of a decade of Pinkerton work who would now know where he was. Not any of those things. He was afraid of losing her. He said it out loud to the dark and the horse and the empty creek hollow, not loud, just enough to make it real. The precise weight of that particular loss was something he knew too well. He had been carrying it for 5 years. He knew exactly what it cost and what it took from a person, and how a man rebuilt himself afterward, or tried to, or gave up trying, and went up a mountain instead. He knew all of this, and he was choosing to risk it anyway. He sat there until the sky began to gray. Then he saddled Ghost and rode the second day harder than he had ridden in years. P.T. Morrison was at the cottonwood with the double trunk at the north end of the main road when Colt came down the ridge trail at dusk on the 5th day. The boy stepped forward and held up the note without hesitation, clearly proud of himself. And Colt took it and read it in the saddle. He adjusted his course. He came into the east end of town after dark, moving along the back of the buildings with Ghost on a loose rein, reading the shadows. Hank Briggs was at the base of the ridge trail, alone. He gave Colt the layout without being asked. 3 men on rotation watching the clinic. Wade himself at the bank in the evenings. A 4th man positioned on the roof of the hardware store covering the length of Main Street. "You telling me this," Colt said. "Yes, sir." "Why?" Hank looked straight at him. "Because I am done." Colt looked at the young man for a moment. He thought about the months Hank had lived with Wade's leverage on him, the slow weight of a secret that was not really a secret, the way that kind of thing hollows a man out from the inside if he lets it go on long enough. "Can you hold a badge for 1 more day?" Colt said. "Yes, sir." "Do not make a move until you see me in the street. When you do, come out from wherever you are and put your hand on Wade's arm. Just your hand. You do not need anything else." Hank nodded. Colt moved through the back alley to the clinic's rear door. He knocked twice the way they had agreed. The door opened immediately and Nora was there, dressed and awake, her green eyes taking him in from boots to hat and back, with the assessing speed of a physician checking for damage. He stepped inside. She looked at him for 1 second and then stepped back to let him pass, and he went by her and into the lamplit clinic and stopped. In the corner of the room, sitting in the chair with a blanket around his shoulders and a bandaged wound visible at his collar, was a man Colt had last seen 3 years ago in a description of his own death. Colt went completely still. The man was thinner, older by more than 3 years. His hair had gone fully gray at the temples, and his face had the weathered, careful look of someone who had been outdoors and watchful for a long time. He was watching Colt with the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed a reunion in his head for years and has just discovered that no rehearsal was adequate. "Close the door," Marcus Webb said. Colt closed the door. He stood looking at the man he had believed was dead and felt the anger come up through him, clean and genuine, not the cold, managed anger he kept for situations that required control, but the real kind, the kind that comes from grief and is indistinguishable from grief at the edges. "You let me think you were dead," he said. "I know. 3 years?" "I know, Colt." "Why?" Marcus shifted in the chair and winced slightly at the shoulder. "Because after Santa Fe, I was in a creek for 4 hours playing dead. And by the time I could move, I had decided that being dead was the only thing that kept Wade from sending more men. I needed him to stop looking. A pause. And you were on a mountain not taking visitors. You could have found a way. You could have come down. They looked at each other across the room. 5 years of accumulated loss was in that look. All the people and things and versions of themselves that were gone, and the specific, complicated feeling of finding that something you had buried was still alive and standing in front of you. Colt crossed the room and sat down across from Marcus and said, "What have you got?" Marcus had 3 years of work spread across the clinic floor in 20 minutes. Names, dates, dollar amounts, the full structure of the land scheme across 4 territories, sworn statements from 6 witnesses who had each agreed to testify. It was thorough in the way that only sustained, methodical patience can produce. It was enough to put Wade Rutherford in the territorial prison at Cannon City for the remainder of his natural life. Colt worked through it piece by piece. Nora sat across from him and matched each document against what she had built from her father's materials and from the county records. The picture that emerged was complete, cross-referenced, and airtight. In the last section of Marcus's file, there was a Pinkerton internal dispatch from 5 years ago. The one that had given Wade the precise timetable for the Glenwood Pass escort, filed by a Pinkerton operative. The signature at the bottom was damaged, blurred by water and time. The letters collapsed into each other. Marcus had noted it. He had been unable to read it clearly for 3 years. Colt picked it up and held it near the lamp. He knew that handwriting. He had seen it on land transfer documents, on notarized filings, on forms stamped and filed in the county records office of Coldwater Bluff. He had nodded to the man who wrote it twice in the main street, Clarence Aldridge, Coldwater Bluff's postmaster, 14 years as a Pinkerton before his retirement to this quiet town. A man who had been here the whole time, a man who had been watching. Colt set the paper face down on the table. His hands were steady. This was something he had trained into his hands through a very long time. But Nora was watching him, and she saw what was underneath the steadiness, and she said nothing, and did not look away. "Tomorrow morning," Colt said. "Yes," she said. Marcus settled back in his chair with the careful movement of a man with a healing wound. "Main Street?" "Main Street." They sat in the lamp-lit clinic in the dark, the 3 of them, with everything they needed laid out in front of them, and they talked through the morning until there was nothing left to plan. Outside, Coldwater Bluff slept. The hardware store across the street was dark. The bank was dark. The mountain rose above the town, black and indifferent against a sky beginning to thin toward morning. Colt did not sleep. He sat in the chair by the fire and watched the light change and thought about 12 minutes and what 5 years of carrying that weight had cost him, and what it would cost him to set it down. Some weights you do not set down by forgetting them. You set them down by deciding they have been carried long enough, and the carrying itself has become the problem. He sat there until the sky went from black to purple to the first clear gray of a winter dawn. Then he stood up and got his coat and checked his rifle. The morning came in cold and clear, the kind of Colorado sky that looks close enough to touch, blue and hard, and absolutely without mercy. Colt walked into the center of Main Street at 9 o'clock. He walked from the north end, from the direction of the ridge, in plain sight and without any hurry. He was wearing his good coat. He wore his hat straight. He had the rifle in the saddle scabbard behind him, not in his hands. This was deliberate. A man with his rifle out is looking for a fight. A man with his rifle in the scabbard is something more patient than that. And patience, in Colt Hargrove's experience, was the thing that actually scared people. He stopped in the center of the street and stood there. The town came out slowly, the way a town comes out when it senses something is happening and cannot decide whether to watch or step back from. A woman at a window. A man stopping in front of the general store. 2 boys at the alley mouth between the feed store and the saddlery. Word ran down the street ahead of whatever was coming the way water finds its level. At 9:15, the bank door opened. Wade Rutherford came out in his good coat with 2 men behind him who had the looser, more deliberate walk of men who were paid for a specific type of work. He came to the edge of the boardwalk and stopped and looked at Colt in the street with the expression of a man who had prepared for this and was not going to let it show that he had needed to. "Colt Hargrove," he said pleasantly. "I heard you were back." Colt's voice carried down the length of the street without any effort. "Wade Rutherford. I have a signed authorization from Judge Elias Cormack of the 2nd Territorial District. I have sworn testimony from 6 witnesses across 4 territories. I have documented evidence of land fraud, forgery of official documents, and the first-degree murder of Dr. Edmund Calloway of this town." He paused one beat. "You can come with me to the sheriff's office, or I can bring the paperwork to you. Either way, this is the last morning you spend as a free man." The street was quiet, completely quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a large number of people are holding their breath at the same time. Wade did not move from the boardwalk. He looked at Colt with those inventory eyes, and he made a decision and he let the mask come all the way down. "You think this is about paperwork," he said. His voice had lost the pleasantness. What was underneath it was harder and more real. "You always thought it was about rules, about doing things the right way. The Pinkerton way." He paused. "That is why Clara died, Colt. Because you believed in the rules. You trusted the system. You trusted me." He said the last word with deliberate weight. "How did that work out for your wife?" The street was absolutely still. Colt looked at Wade Rutherford across the cold main street of Coldwater Bluff, and he felt the thing Wade was trying to reach. The old grief, the guilt, the 12 minutes, all of it sitting right there, available to be used as a weapon. He felt Wade's hand reaching for it. He did not give it to him. "I know," Colt said, and his voice was even. "I know exactly what I did wrong and what it cost. I have known it every day for 5 years." He paused. "I did not come here to stop knowing it. I came here because knowing it is not enough. Because your bill is due, and I am the one holding it." Wade's hand moved toward his coat. At that moment, a shot rang out. It did not come from the street. It came from the roof of the hardware store 30 yards behind and above Wade's position. It hit the dirt at Wade's feet. A warning shot placed with a precision that said the shooter had chosen exactly where it landed. Everyone froze. On the roof of the hardware store, a figure stood up, with his hands raised and his rifle held out to one side, not aimed at anyone. 17 years old, Tommy Briggs, Hank's younger brother, the boy who had spent the last 14 months doing odd jobs for Wade Rutherford without fully understanding what he was working for. His voice cracked when he called down. "I heard them last night. Wade's men. They were going to shoot Hargrove from behind when the shooting started in the street." He swallowed. "I am not going to let them do that. I am not." He set the rifle on the roof edge and sat down with his hands open and visible. On the far side of the roof, a second figure scrambled upright. One of Wade's hired guns, the 4th man Hank had described. He had had a clean line to Colt's back during the entire confrontation and had been in the process of taking it when Tommy had shoved the barrel sideways. Colt looked up at the roof. He looked at Tommy Briggs sitting there with his hands open and his face white, and his jaw set in the way of someone who has made a decision that scared him half to death and is not going to walk it back. 14 months ago, in a shaft 20 feet underground, Colt had pulled this boy out by the arms while the ceiling came down behind them. He had not thought about it after. It had not seemed like the kind of thing that required thinking about after. He thought about it now. Hank Briggs stepped out from the alley beside the bank with his badge catching the morning light. He moved to Wade's side and put his hand on Wade's arm with the quiet authority of someone who has decided, completely and finally, what kind of man he is going to be. "Wade Rutherford," Hank said. "You are under arrest." Wade looked at Hank's hand on his arm. He looked at the watching street. He looked at Colt. "This is not finished," he said. "You understand that. I did not run this alone. There is someone in this town who gave me your schedule 5 years ago. Ask yourself who it was. Ask yourself why they have been standing here watching this whole time and nobody has said a word. Colt reached inside his coat. He took out a folded document and walked to the boardwalk and placed it on the railing in front of Wade. Clarence Aldridge, Colt said. Postmaster. 14 years with the Pinkertons before he retired here. He filed the dispatch that told you when Clara's wagon would be on that road. The heads along the street turned. Clarence Aldridge was standing at the far edge of the gathered crowd, 63 years old, dressed in his usual working clothes. A man who had spent 8 years being a quiet and unremarkable fixture of this town. Every face on the street found him at the same moment. He did not run. He stood where he was. He looked at Colt across the crowd, and his face had the look of a man who's been waiting for exactly this, and is in some specific way relieved that the waiting is over. Rutherford had information on me, too, Aldridge said. His voice carried. It was the voice of an old man who has decided on honesty as the last available form of dignity. I did not know they would kill her. I gave him the schedule thinking it was a robbery. I did not know there was a woman on that wagon. I swear to God, I did not know. The street was absolutely silent. Colt looked at Clarence Aldridge for a long time. He thought about 12 minutes. He thought about the weight he had been carrying and whether setting it down meant forgiveness, and whether forgiveness was even the right word for what happened when a man finally stops letting the past be the only thing in the room. I believe you, Colt said. It does not change what you owe. Marcus Webb stepped forward from the clinic doorway where he had been standing with the shoulder wound and 3 years of documentation. He had a separate sworn statement regarding Aldridge already prepared, because he had suspected the man for 2 years and had been ready. Hank arrested both Wade Rutherford and Clarence Aldridge. The street remained still for another moment. Then Ruth McAllister, who had been standing in the doorway of her boarding house with her hands clasped in front of her, let out a long, slow breath and said something quietly to herself that nobody could hear. Nora came across the street. She had been at the corner of the clinic with Ruth, back far enough to be clear of the line of fire, close enough that Colt could see her from the street. He had looked at her once before he walked into the center of the street, and she had nodded, a small, certain nod. And that had been enough. She came to him now and looked at his arm where the graze had caught him, the shot that had gone into the roof when Tommy shoved the gunman sideways, the bullet that had taken a piece of his coat sleeve and a surface line of skin. That needs cleaning, she said. I know. Come inside. I know. He followed her into the clinic. The town watched them go. Ruth McAllister put her apron to her mouth for a moment and held it there. Then she straightened up and began moving through the crowd, speaking in her practical, carrying voice, telling people that the excitement was finished and they had work to get back to. In the 2-cell town jail behind the sheriff's office, Wade Rutherford and Clarence Aldridge sat and waited for the transfer that would take them to Colorado City and the district court that would decide the remainder of their lives. The morning was not yet half over. The mountain above the town was bright with winter sun, every pine and granite face lit clean. The sky above it, the hard, deep blue of a Colorado morning that does not care what happened in the street below, but shines on it all the same. The Territorial District Court at Colorado City took jurisdiction within 2 weeks. Wade Rutherford faced charges of murder in the 1st degree, criminal fraud across 4 territories, conspiracy, and the bribery of a public official. The court was thorough and not particularly fast, and did not need to be fast, because Marcus Webb's 3 years of documentation made the outcome something that could be seen from a considerable distance. Wade Rutherford would spend the rest of his years at the territorial prison at Cannon City, which sat at the foot of the mountains in a place that was scenic in the way that things can be beautiful and merciless at the same time. Clarence Aldridge pleaded to criminal conspiracy and accessory to murder. He was 63 years old. He cooperated fully. The court noted his age and his cooperation and sentenced him accordingly. He would not die in prison. He would not return to Coldwater Bluff. These were the terms of the rest of his life, and he accepted them with the steadiness of a man who had already been living with the sentence in some form for 5 years. Hank Briggs submitted a written account of his own conduct to Judge Cormack. The incident 2 years ago, the silence that followed, the reasons for it, and the choice he had made in the end. He did not ask for anything from the account. He submitted it because it was accurate. Judge Cormack read it in his office in Colorado City, and then he looked at the young deputy who had come in person to file it, and he said, "Son, the day you put your hand on Wade Rutherford's arm in that street is the day you became the lawman this town needed. Do not waste that." Hank kept his badge. Tommy Briggs was not charged. He was 17 years old. He had acted to prevent a murder. A street full of witnesses had watched him throw his rifle down and put his hands in the air. The law, properly applied, had nothing to hold against him. On the afternoon after the hearing, without Tommy's knowledge, Colt sat down and wrote a detailed account of the Harwick mine collapse 14 months prior. He wrote about what Tommy Briggs had been doing that day and how he had found him in the shaft and what the boy had done in the weeks after to repay a debt he had not been asked to repay. He gave the account to Hank to file with the court record as a character statement. Tommy never knew about it. Marcus Webb stayed. He opened a small land title office in the space beside the general store, 2 rooms, a desk, a filing cabinet, and the 3 years of expertise in exactly what fraudulent documentation looked like. People came to him before they signed anything related to land, and he reviewed their paperwork and told them what was real and what was not. He was not the warmest personality in Coldwater Bluff. He was the most reliable. One evening, Colt and Marcus sat outside the boarding house in the cold with 2 glasses of whiskey and almost no conversation. The night was clear, and the stars were out in the way they get at high altitude, too many to count, the whole sky packed with them. Marcus said, "I thought you were dead, the real kind." Colt turned his glass. "I was working on it." "She stopped you." A pause that ran long. "I stopped myself," Colt said. "She gave me a reason to." Marcus nodded and drank his whiskey and looked at the stars. And that was enough said between 2 men who had spent most of their lives saying things with actions rather than words. On the second morning after the arrests, Nora could not find Colt in town. She had looked in the expected places. His camp at the tree line was empty, the lean-to neatly stowed. The livery where Ghost was currently boarded showed the stall empty. She walked to the boarding house and Ruth had not seen him. She stood in the street and looked around in the way you look when you have misplaced something important. Then she looked at Ghost's stall in the livery and found the horse looking back at her. She had started doing this, consulting the horse somewhere around the 2nd week of knowing them both, and she was not embarrassed about it. Ghost had consistently demonstrated better judgment than most of the people she had met in Colorado territory. She put her hand on his neck. He turned his head toward the eastern tree line. She walked. The clearing was 30 yards past the last building on the eastern edge of town, tucked into a break in the tree line where the ground was level and sheltered from the main wind. She had never found it because she had never had reason to walk this far east. There was a wooden marker at the center of the clearing, simple, hand-carved, maintained carefully against the weather. The name in the wood was Clara Hargrove. Her dates, quietly given. Beneath them, 3 words that Colt had put there himself. For keeping watch. He was standing with his hat in his hands, his back to the tree line, looking at the marker with the still, present attention of a man who comes to a place regularly and knows how to be in it. Nora stopped at the edge of the clearing. She meant to give him the privacy of it, but his hearing was too good, trained by years alone in the mountains to register everything, and he heard her footsteps on the frozen ground. He did not turn around. "I buried her here," he said. His voice was quiet and ordinary, not strained. "Before I went up the mountain. I could not go that far and leave her in a town cemetery where I might never come back." A pause. "I needed to know where she was." Nora stood at the edge of the clearing and listened. "I come here every week," he said. "I have since I first put the marker up. I come and I tell her what I have been doing. For 4 years, that was not much of a story. He was quiet a moment. Last week, I had something different to tell her. Nora walked across the clearing. She came to stand beside him, close enough that her arm was against his. "What did you tell her?" she said. He turned to look at her. His face was open in a way it had not been, perhaps in years, perhaps longer than years. Not broken, not performing, just honest, the way a face looks when a man has finally stopped using it to keep things out. "That I found someone who does not need saving and will not ask for it," he said. "And that is exactly why I cannot stop thinking about her." He paused. "I told her I was ready." Nora took his hand. She took it the way she would take a pulse, practical and certain. No hesitation in the gesture, because hesitation was not something she did when she was sure. And she was sure. She had been sure for longer than she had been willing to say it plainly, even to herself. They stood in the clearing for a while, the two of them, and the marker and the mountain beyond the tree line, in whatever way the living stand with those they have lost and chosen to carry forward, which is not the same as forgetting and not the same as letting go, but is something that moves, that takes a step, that chooses the next morning. The pines around them were perfectly still. 2 weeks later, the mornings were starting to ease, just barely, just enough to promise that winter would not last forever. Nora was on the clinic porch at first light with coffee, her hair loose, wearing her working clothes, watching the ridge turn gold as the sun came over it. She could hear Colt in the small room at the back of the clinic where he had been sleeping since the week after the arrests. He had asked about the room in the way of a man who has a real reason prepared and knows the real reason is not the reason. He had said it was for proximity in case of a medical emergency. She had not argued. She had simply taken the second key from the hook by the door and set it on the kitchen table where he would see it. He came around the side of the building and she handed him the second cup from the porch railing. He stood beside her and they both looked up at Black Elk Ridge, at the dark line of pine giving way to the pale granite near the top, at the last of the winter snow on the highest faces. "You ever miss it?" she said. "The cabin." He thought about it honestly. "Sometimes, the quiet up there." "Is it quiet enough down here?" He looked at the street below them. Ruth was pulling open the boarding house shutters. Hank was walking his morning patrol, nodding to the few people already moving on the boardwalk. Billy Harwick came running around the corner of the feed store with a bread roll in one hand, spotted them on the porch, and waved without stopping, already running toward wherever 9-year-old boys ran at that hour. "No," Colt said. "It is not quiet." He did not say anything else for a moment. "I do not need it to be quiet anymore," he said. Nora leaned slightly against his arm. He did not move. He was warm beside her in the cold morning air, and steady in the way of something that had been tested and had held. Ghost stood at the post below the porch, ground-tied, his black coat catching the early light. He raised his head and regarded the two people on the porch above him with the patient, knowing expression of a horse who had figured out the important thing some time ago and had been waiting for the people to catch up. The mountain above the town was the same mountain it had always been, dark and permanent, rising above everything that happened at its feet with the complete indifference of something that has been standing longer than memory. It did not care about the reckoning that had happened in the street below it. It did not care about the graves at the tree line, or the cleared land, or the 2-cell jail behind the sheriff's office. It would be standing when all of it was dust. But the man on that porch was not dust. He was present and accounted for, standing in the cold morning air with a cup of coffee in his hand, and a woman beside him who had come up a mountain trail in a blizzard, and looked down a rifle barrel without flinching, and had been, without entirely meaning to, the answer to a question he had stopped believing was worth asking. And the mountain, for all its permanence and indifference, had no say at all in what was growing at its feet, between those two people, in the hard ground of a Colorado winter giving way to spring. That was theirs alone.